Well, the United Nations Climate Conference, COP28, has dropped the phasing out of fossil fuels. Australia's position, presented by Climate Minister Chris Bowen and supported by the US, Britain and Norway, calling for the end of unabated fossil fuels, has not survived. Joining me now live is foreign editor at The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Greg, thanks for joining us. How does this look for Australia on a global scale, particularly as Australia is continuing its pathway to renewables?
Well, Danica, the whole thing is just a big joke. I mean, Chris Bowen can talk about phasing out fossil fuels, but I tell you what, we'll all be broke. We won't have to worry about Medicare or the NDIS or something because there'll be no money to fund any of it. I mean, our biggest exports are coal, gas, we produce some of our own oil. If we phase out fossil fuels from Australia, we also won't have an immigration program because we won't have any money to do anything with. I mean, it's just nonsense. But so much of this stuff in this green area is complete junk. You know, the United States claims it's in favour of phasing out fossil fuels. It is now the biggest producer and exporter of natural gas in the world. And in September, it produced 13.2 million barrels of oil a day, the biggest quantity that it has ever produced. Fossil fuels today account for 82% of global energy, which is more or less exactly the same as the percentage was a decade ago. Coal use last year was at a record high. The increased demand from China, India and Indonesia more than offset the decreased demand from the United States, Europe and Japan. So these COP processes, they deal in a kind of bizarre fantasy. And I tell you what, if Chris Bowen wants to take to the next election the idea that the Labor government will end fossil fuels in Australia, you know, you watch out, get ready for Prime Minister Peter Dutton.
Well, look, there's been certainly a lot of mixed messaging coming out of the COP summit, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I want to move overseas now because there's been a big week, of course, with the Republican candidates' presidential debate. How are they looking, and do you think it's still Donald Trump's race to lose here?
Yes, I do, Danica. I think Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley have established themselves as the two alternatives to Trump. Haley has been doing better than DeSantis, but she mainly appeals to the people in the party who don't like Trump. So if Trump had to stand aside because of his criminal prosecutions or some such, it's not clear whether it'd be DeSantis or Haley who inherited the mantle. It's very hard to see either of them defeating Trump in a normal primary. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, Joe Biden is determined, it looks, to run. And, you know, I've got very good contacts in American politics who say that Biden will only step aside if there's some sort of catastrophic health intervention, some event that forces him to stand aside. But that means the vast majority of Americans desperately don't want either of these men to run. But that's the choice they're going to get. And for Australia and the world, it's a very bad choice because Biden is plainly past it, and Trump is plainly now even more twisted out of shape than he was before because of the criminal prosecutions he's suffered. So either of them is likely to be a very erratic and difficult president. And if Biden gets re-elected, as he well might, even though Trump's ahead in the polls, it's almost certain he couldn't serve a 4-year term. So then you get Kamala Harris, who is a tremendously unimpressive vice president. I mean, this has got to be the worst choice as Americans have ever faced since the last time when it was Trump versus Biden as well.
Have you been surprised by Nikki Haley's apparent rise in popularity suddenly? It was clear during that last debate that the other candidates, they were particularly picking on her, and she seems to have taken it in her stride. Is she a genuine threat?
Yeah, I think she's done really well. She's done really well. So she's a great story. Punjabi immigrant Sikh parents. She was governor of, I think it was North Carolina, so she was a 2-term governor. So that's a very common pedigree to becoming president. It means you've run an executive government, you know how to make decisions, you know about electoral compromise. She had a period as the United States ambassador to the United Nations, which means she's had a very good training in global politics and all the rest of it. She is the bolter of this cycle. So you often get a bolter in a cycle. I mean, it was Clinton in his cycle, it was Obama in his cycle. It doesn't, however, mean that she's going to win necessarily. So you'd still think Trump wins, and you'd still think if Trump disappears, DeSantis might yet be the pick of the people who would otherwise vote for Trump. Although DeSantis, although he's very competent, very impressive governor of Florida, he just hasn't caught fire. There's a bit of magic in electoral politics. The electorate has to kind of fall in love with you a bit. And Nikki Haley is much easier for voters to fall in love with, it turns out, than Ron DeSantis is. So Haley is very well placed should Trump fall over or, you know, who knows, maybe as a vice president or conceivably even as a third party. I mean, she has certainly built up a lot of political capital during this primary process.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch. Greg Sheridan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Tamika.